what is the impending collapse that you write about in your book after collapse that you see in the US? So that's the first part of the question. And the second part would be, what are the solutions for a post-collapse society? And what is this integral liberalism that you teased us with? So your floor.
Sure, thank you. I happen to have it here. It's a good thing. But there are 7 dimensions of what I call breakdown in American society, and I don't mean this to be, as Thaddeus said earlier, parochial American stuff. It's a framing device in one sense, and in another, it's very real problems. But the first thing is the breakdown of the metaphors and models we use to talk about American society. I think a lot of experts and authorities are stuck in a kind of machine metaphor, that there are these causal relationships in society that can be understood and manipulated in certain ways to give about some pro-social effect. I criticize this view, but think it's so pervasive that it's leading to the breakdown of the social order in many respects, particularly as those who would control the economy and society are under the sway of these broken metaphors. The second is the breakdown of hierarchies, and I appeal to complex adaptive systems theory in this, particularly the work of Bar-Yam, and someone mentioned Hayek earlier, but the idea is that hierarchies break down and there are replacements on the horizon for hierarchical orders. And I mean, what I mean by that is rigid hierarchies or dominance hierarchies, where you subordinate someone, or either through sticks and carrots subordinate to create some sort of collective action. And hierarchies tend to break down due to information problems of complexity. The third is the breakdown of our belief in liberalism, our belief in the idea that that people ought to be, that not only that freedom and self-organization is a good thing, but some of the liberal values that come along with that. And these are ancient values. They start, many, many millennia ago. So it's not just a Western weird thing. The fourth is the breakdown of community and mutual aid. With the rise of the sort of collectivist welfare states, we saw the sort of the diminishment of close ties, mutual aid ties, where the people in your community and you're able to make certain kinds of assessments about whether or not someone is in need of financial support or a kick in the ass or whatever, or just a stern talking to, or a hug. I mean, these are not things that states do well. And when we allowed hyper-capitalism to proceed in parallel with the welfare state, people began to outsource their sense of responsibility and compassion for others, because I pay my taxes and someone else is doing it. So that is continuing to break down. The breakdown of collective intelligence is really how we know, how we track truth. And I am sensitive to the postmodern plight. We are mediated by screens, and indeed we are subjective entities. We haven't stopped being situated in our subjectivity. But as a nod to the metamoderns or the second tier folks, it is important to begin to craft narratives and good old-fashioned ideas about where creating systems where you have skin in the game, or whether there are higher costs to being wrong in your opinions and your assessments. Right now, it's a low-cost proposition to hold all sorts of stupid beliefs, and people therefore do them. In fact, they get rewarded for holding stupid beliefs, and nobody tracks truth. And we're seeing that in the age of fake news and narrative warfare now. It's rather a hall of mirrors. Sixth, the breakdown of discourse and civil order, and particularly the reactionaries on the one side and the victimologist on the other. This is this is the rise of wokeism alongside the rise of the other side, which are reactionaries, trolls, and so on. And they suck all the oxygen out of real conversations that deliberative and people like you guys want to have. It just becomes a spectacle between people with Molotov cocktails on the left and tiki torches on the right, and it just creates a massive shit show for the rest of us. Excuse my language. And finally, we have the breakdown of the federal government. We're just simply unsustainable spending, debt spending that could lead to sovereign debt crisis. I think is something that needs to have the kind of have the energy around it, and just the focus on that for future generations, because we're essentially handing our children and grandchildren a massive tsunami of red ink, and we are going to drown in it if we're not careful. So the institutions, the ghastly Leviathan institutions that slink at the bottom of the ocean of red ink, no one is looking at. And to me, these fiscal issues are just as important as issues like, the health of our global ecosystems and so on. So that's generally the framing on all these dimensions we're breaking down in American society, and I think in many other societies as well. And this creates unhealthy and unsustainable dynamics. I'm framing it as collapse. Yes, it's sensational, but I have to compete in an evolutionary fitness landscape with other sensational titles. So you'll forgive me for that. Hopefully, once you get into the book, you'll see something a little subtler and a little more interesting than sensational title. I won't talk about, I'll just sum up part 2 so I don't bang on, and I want to give everyone else time. Part 2 is really, starting with the idea of reimagining liberalism, this integral liberalism, where we re-embrace what I call the spheres, and the spheres being these ancient moral practices that turn out to be rather immortal, and they, for very good reasons, resemble the yamas from the Yoga Sutras and some of the other Vedic traditions, but also they synthesize with some of the Western notions that we're more familiar with. And I believe that if we re-embrace these culturally, these as cultural values and internalize them as active practices. So instead of thinking of bare abstract moral rules, if you think of active moral practices, we become more and more trained in our moral sensibilities. And this isn't something I would have said a few years ago, but I'm coming around to this view, so much so that I made it the basis of part 2. And that what gets unleashed from this idea of these ancient moral practices that I believe are universal and timeless in some sense is this polyarchic order, this emergent, continual, decentralized order where we see systems like holacracy emerge within corporations, which you might know as teal organizations, sociocracy similarly, that these kind of organizational dynamics are what is meant to replace old hierarchies, and that these can scale. And what we'll start to see is this polyarchic order based on consent, and frankly, based on human respect, and not so much on the purported wisdom or expertise of authorities. And so it really is this slow movement towards asymptotic anarchy after collapse.
Awesome. Thank you very much for this sweeping overview. Any of the panelists care to chime in here?
I'd like to engage with Max about what you said. That sounds very interesting. I look forward to reading your book. As you described part 1 and all of the various lines of decay, we can maybe call it, I wouldn't argue with the general outlines of that. The way I like to look at it, though, in terms of my hopelessly optimistic outlook, is that there are certainly gnarly forces of decay, and those are always present, in greater or lesser intensity in any societal situation. But I would say that there's also forces of growth, that are not entirely countervailing, but we wouldn't be where we are now if there wasn't something to overcome the incessant, entropy of decay in our cultural circumstances. So you talked about the polyarchic as a beginning of a description of where you're identifying the force of growth, or the countervailing potential to go beyond. Do you see it as inevitably we're going to have to crash and collapse before the forces of growth can gain more traction, or is there, maybe you could elaborate more on the potential of those forces of growth to triumph in spite of decay, or maybe even in lieu of collapse?
Yeah, that is my deepest hope, of course. One hopes in writing a book that you show people the way, or that you join with a whole bunch of other people like the folks sitting here who share similar thoughts and sensibilities, and that these spread outward, and suddenly we have all these more experiments that are running in parallel with the decaying order, no doubt. And my hope is that it could be viewed as in hindsight as the collapse of the old order, or the realization that one of the things I discuss is the thanatos versus eros as these motivating instincts within us, as well as the masculine and the feminine. And I argue that the eros feminine is rising, and that this is actually a good thing, and that the thanatos feminine is also something we need to pay attention to, which is this let it flow instinct in us, and let it go with so let it flow being the generative instincts, allowing some of these parallel structures to emerge and to flower, but also letting go of this old order a little bit, because it is perhaps no longer serving us. And to the extent that we can take the healthy aspects of the old order, internalize it, and have that be fertilizer for this new growth after collapse, absolutely. But I don't want or hope or even draw much of a picture of devastation. I warn that it could be absolutely devastating, and I don't want us to collapse into warlordism, or, as you described it earlier, Steve, a pre-modern state, or factionalized, balkanized, and otherwise ugly. But we do see these cycles of beginnings and endings, as we have with all empires. And I think Thaddeus is right that we are an empire in the United States, and that it is unsustainable in its scope and in its reach. So not just externally in terms of foreign relations, but internally in terms of all the special interests and groups that politics attempts to satisfy with its transferism. So I think that's just a wonderful question, and I'm so glad you brought it up, because I do want to emphasize the after part, and hopefully, after doesn't have to be it doesn't have to happen after. It doesn't have to be a collapse scenario, that it can actually just be a transition that is somewhat seamless, that has, pockets of disturbance and disruption, but doesn't have to go to zero before it reascends. Absolutely.
Well, maybe good point to shift to the next.
Give me a second, Dennis. Thaddeus, sure. What's your take on this?
Okay.
Well, as I understand it, everyone here, including my good comrade Max, has expressed at least some sympathy for liberalism. You will not hear any sympathy for liberalism from me. And let me go even farther and set even more people's hair on fire. I am talking about both its classical and its 20th century variants. I think that both need to be jettisoned entirely. And I can get into it. I can do a sort of schematic critique of both real quickly, just to get people shouting at me. But to me, in its classical form, John Locke said that the problem with the Indians is that they are not maximizing the utility of the land they're living on. The gorgeous North American plains with all its fertile soil. And therefore, they needed, he said, to be replaced by productive people, by productive settlers. That idea also within classical liberalism of the productive individual also depended upon the idea of the self-disciplining, self-regulating individual, which is at the core of both Puritanism and Victorian culture, which reigns supreme in this country, unfortunately, and still do to a large extent. So that's something I hate the most about the United States, as a matter of fact, is our puritanical culture. And that actually comes from classical liberalism. Now, the 20th century version of liberalism is a death machine. I don't see anything in it worth, to me, 20th century liberalism is eugenics, it's the atom bomb, it's Vietnam, it is social workers in Black women's houses in the projects asking them who they slept with. It's children being put into cages every day that are called schools and kept there. It is global hysteria, lockdown, panic about COVID when we knew exactly how to treat it correctly, which is to treat the people who are actually vulnerable to it rather than a universal, right? Very liberal idea, very progressive idea. Everyone must sacrifice for, I guess, the common good, which of course is derived from Christianity, which is progressivism's base. The empire, the American.
Can I just respond to that laundry list?
Sure. Go ahead, sure.
Just about everything you listed there is not under any conception of liberalism that I'm familiar with. Now, we have to make a distinction between the 20th century variant of modern liberalism, which is just an outgrowth or repackaging or rebranding of progressivism, early 20th century progressivism, which was eugenicist, which was, and so on. John Locke happens to have had some quite classical liberal ideas, such as the idea of making property productive. But the idea of property rights, if extended to Native Americans, would have protected them. And so, it's just like any philosophical worldview, and at whatever stage of you healthy aspects. I want to say that none of the things you named my conception of liberalism, and I think it would be a bit unfair even to ascribe most of the things you said to the classical liberals apart from Locke. But in terms of the history of ideas, it sounds like what you're describing is a whole lot of different apologetics for either authoritarian variants or progressivism, early 20th century progressivism. So I think we just, to get our terms straight, we wouldn't radically disagree. Well, I don't think.
Well, I don't know. I'm confused because when I talk about 20th century liberalism, this is who I'm talking about. I name names. I can name names. Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. So those are people everyone in the world calls liberals. So I don't know why they're not liberals to you. Well, I mean, I guess I'm steeped in the language of the philosophical traditions. So, for example, you might around the world, most people who identify as liberals, the Americans call libertarians. No, I understand that. I know. That's why I said the classical liberalism and 20th century liberalism are very different things. They both deeply inform our culture, both here and in Europe, and I think they are both deeply problematic and both need to be jettisoned in their entirety. That's my radical take, but I think they're different. I hear you. They're very different in many ways, but they are both deeply problematic from my perspective.
So, values like freedom, toleration. I mean, these are classical liberal values. You think that should be jettisoned?
So I don't think they're actually freedom and toleration. Well, I think the toleration is a terrible concept, actually. So what toleration is, which comes actually from not so much Locke, but actually Thomas Paine and others, but it doesn't matter. I think we're on the same page on what it means. It means that I'm going to give you permission to say what you want to say, maybe. I'm going to give you permission to be Black or a woman in this space. I'm going to allow you and give you, we as a society are going to tolerate you. I mean, there's also an element of condescension and paternalism in the word. I don't like the word at all. And then freedom, as I said,